Welcome to this rapid revision video which looks at my reflections for the 2024 EdExcel Paper 2 GCSE History exam. The topics that I'll be looking at are the same ones that I did my predictions for: Saxon and Norman England, early Elizabethan England, the American West and superpower relations. One quick suggestion: if you're at all anxious about your performance in the Paper 2 exam, then please forget about that and just move on with it. You might want to go and check out my predictions for Paper 3, but I would recommend that you give this video a skip. There's every chance that I'll say something about one of the topics in here and then you'll wish that you put it in there and you'll be worried about it. And there's no point doing that to yourself. However, if you are pretty confident, or if you're just curious to see what I thought of each of these exams and to see if I got any of my predictions right, then please watch on. We're going to start with Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. Let's have a look at what questions came up for this exam. Question 1A was describe two features of Anglo-Saxon government. That was worth 4 marks. Question 1B was explain why the Normans built so many castles in England during William I's reign. That was worth 12 marks. The stimulus points that we were given were England's border with Wales and rebellions. And then you had a choice. Either question 1C1, after the death of Edward the Confessor, Edgar the Atheling had the strongest claim to the throne. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. The stimulus points for this particular question were family connection between Edward and Edgar and the House of Godwin. Or you could have chosen question C2. Robert's ambition to take control in Normandy was the main reason for the difficult relationship between William I and his son Robert. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. That was worth 16 marks as well. The stimulus points for this particular question were Robert's revolt in Normandy 1077 to 1080 and Robert's childhood. So what do I think of these questions? Well, starting with question 1A, I thought that was a pretty reasonable question. Two features of Anglo-Saxon government, there's an awful lot of things that you could have chosen from there. It could have been about how the king governed, it could have been about the Witan, it could have been about the earls. There's all sorts of things that you could mention in there. So quite easy, I think, to get two detailed examples. In terms of the castles question, I considered this to be another pretty generous one. So you've been given the clue about England's border with Wales, so thinking about securing the border from Welsh raids. You could have mentioned the Marcher earldoms and how they had the right to build their own castles and establishment in addition to what other noblemen would have. And also you could have mentioned their use in rebellions. For example, during the early rebellions, castles were often built in troublesome areas to try and suppress the natives, or indeed to actually suppress any chance of a rebellion happening in the first place. Consider the York rebellions. The original castle in York was burnt down and a second one was built. So that's a pretty clear one. So you could have spoken about the military reasons for building them, the reasons of control, of intimidation and symbolism, of Norman power and the permanence of them staying there. There's absolutely loads that you could actually explain there. In terms of the other two questions, I felt that question C1 was a slightly easier of the two. Most students have got a pretty good understanding of the different factors affecting the succession crisis, so they could probably compare the strength of Edgar the Atheling's claim to some of the others like Harold Godwinson, Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy. So looking at that, you could say whether or not you agreed that Edgar had the strongest claim. Robert's ambition one, I felt this one was a little bit more tricky. It might have even been easier if they'd actually called him Robert Curthose, which is how most of my students remember him, to be more distinctive. But if you do know the story of Robert and William the Conqueror's relationship, you know the stories about him falling out with his brothers, the bucket of, well, shall we say, water being chucked over him and so forth, then there was plenty you could write about there. I suspect that anyone who did write that one was probably someone who had good knowledge of that topic, and they're probably going to do quite well as a result. So overall, I think it's a pretty generous to fair paper. So let's consider the predictions that I made and whether any of these things came up. So in terms of the repeated inclusions, the Marcher earldoms sort of came up again, as did castles very much. So the castles question was very much directly still there, and that's the 4th time that castles have appeared in a paper. And it's got some relevance to the Marcher earldoms as well, because it mentioned the border with Wales. So if you had kind of revised those things, that would have been helpful. However, that's the trouble with repeated inclusions. Sometimes you're tempted not to look at those things because you think, well, they've come up loads of times before. But here's another example, yet again, of the exam board including the same sort of thing again because it's suitable for the question that they want to set. So you can never be too sure, can you? But what about the things that have never appeared or rarely appeared? Well, these are the things that I had identified as having never appeared. Did any of them come up? Well, yes, actually. Anglo-Saxon society, structure, roles and rule. This did come up in the 4-mark question at the start in terms of government. and also the early rebellions to Norman rule might have been relevant to the 12-mark question as well. After all, rebellions was one of the stimulus points in that question. So although it might not have been direct within the question itself, it was one of the stimulus points. And how about the rarely appeared section? Well, the power of Anglo-Saxon kings came up in 2018, and it's come up again, at least in passing. This would have been relevant to question 1A with a 4-marker. But that's the only thing on the rarely appeared section that came up again. So there were quite a few things that had maybe appeared in the paper before, but not for an awful long time, or maybe more recently. So my final summary of this paper for Saxons and Normans. Predictions about Anglo-Saxon society in terms of government and monarchy and early rebellions were relevant to question 1A and 1B. Castles appeared for the 4th time, showing that this is a very popular topic. Surely it won't come up again next year. Anyway, doesn't matter to you now. The 16-mark questions are on topics that have been covered before, for example the succession crises, but not that regularly, and they've maybe focused on a different aspect of these topics. Question 1C2 on Robert Curthose appears to have been less popular based upon the pupil reaction and the staff feedback that I've had. However, pupils have been largely positive about the exam. That's based upon the comments I've had on my YouTube channel and speaking to my own students and just hearing around. So, what do I think of this paper? I think it was pretty fair overall, with good opportunities to draw on a fairly broad range of knowledge, although it's fairly surprising that castles have come up yet again. So not bad, and I hope that you feel that you've done well on this paper. Our next paper is going to be early Elizabethan England. Here's what came up on this year's exam. Question 1A was describe 2 features of education in early Elizabethan England for 4 marks. Question 1B was explain why the Spanish Armada was defeated. That's 12 marks. The stimulus points were Sir Francis Drake and the use of fire ships. And then for the interpretations questions, question C1 was the most significant threat to Elizabeth I's religious settlement in the years 1558 to 68 came from the English Catholics. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. The stimulus points were recusancy fines for not attending church. Yes, they really did put all that in there. I would probably have expected them just to have left it at recusancy fines, but, you know, generous, and can't complain there. And the other one was the Puritan campaign against crucifixes. Or you could have chosen this one. Question C2. Poor planning was the main reason why the first colony in Virginia failed. How far do you agree? Explain your answer. The stimulus points here were Sir Walter Raleigh and the lack of food supplies. So what do I think of this paper? Well, this is a paper that I'm going to be teaching with my current Year 10s who will be going into Year 11 next year. So I'm getting myself pretty familiar with this, and as you've seen, I've made a rapid revision video series based upon that now. The education question I thought was pretty generous. There's lots of different things that you could have written about there. Things about universities, dame schools, grammar schools and so forth. Or maybe even things about the school day and the sort of things that children learned. And indeed the sorts of children who actually got to go to school and older people who were educated as well. So loads that you could write for that. The explain why the Spanish Armada defeated question I thought was also very generous. If you know the events of the Spanish Armada and broadly what happened, you could very easily write a good explanation as to why it was defeated. You'd have to be careful not to write a narrative account by mistake and just describe the story and say what happened. You'd still probably pick up quite a few marks for that. But in terms of explaining why specific factors led to the defeat of the Armada, would be pretty straightforward. In terms of the other 2 questions, I thought they were reasonably fair, to be honest. The most significant threat question about the Catholics and the religious settlement. This is a really big topic. It's almost inevitable, I suppose, that something about tension with Catholics is going to appear on this particular paper, and this one gives you an awful lot to write about. And it's pretty obvious as well what your 2 sides are going to be here. So looking at what sort of resistance there was from English Catholics to the religious settlement, but also what threats there were from more extreme Protestants as well, like the Puritan campaign against crucifixes. So it would have been good to balance your answer with that one. In terms of C2, this is a little bit more niche, and probably this was the one that would have been slightly less popular. However, if you've got a good knowledge of the Age of Exploration and the reasons why the early colonies failed, like Roanoke, then you probably would have done pretty well on this. You'd have understood the weaknesses with Raleigh's planning and who he chose for the expedition. You'd have understood the lack of food supplies and how that made them too reliant on indigenous peoples in America. And again, this is an answer that you could balance pretty well. And so, well, at least in my view, I think the exam board has done a pretty good job of giving you 2 really nicely balanced questions here, with maybe question C1 being the one that you could have more to write about. So let's see how my predictions went with this. These were the things that I'd identified as repeated inclusions for the early Elizabethan England question paper. The religious settlement has come up in the sample paper 2020 and 2021, and now it's come up in 2024 for question 1C that was worth 1C1 I should say, which was worth 16 marks. So again, this just shows that sometimes the exam board will choose things that have come up before, although admittedly the sample paper was an awfully long time ago now, and 2020 and 2021 were reasonably distant as well, so maybe it was just its turn to turn up. It is a really big part of the course after all. Let's consider the things that have never appeared though. Well, not many of these things came up, with one really significant exception. A quick note on the rise of the gentry. Quite a few people asked me about this one here. Remember, I've not actually taught this course yet, and so I'm sort of still learning it myself. Maybe I've used the wrong terminology here. What I meant by that was the rise of a class of people who were wealthy and landed, but not nobility within Elizabethan England. People like your wealthier end of yeoman farmers who had owned their own fairly grand house on the edge of the village, and it's nicely related to things like enclosure as they managed to stake their claims on different bits of land. Anyway, I digress slightly. The big surprise with this one here was that, yes, indeed, the Spanish Armada did turn up. So if you've revised that one in detail, you were probably absolutely delighted with that. It was worth 12 marks as well, which is a decent chunk of the marks in that paper. What about the things that rarely appeared? Well, here are the things that I identified. And sure enough, Catholic challenges to Elizabeth came up in the sample paper in 2019, and I did acknowledge it was quite a big topic, so it could easily come up again in a different format. And sure enough, that is what happened. This was relevant to question 1C1 and was worth 16 marks. So again, you probably were pretty pleased if you revised that. So what are my final thoughts on the Elizabeth paper? Predictions about Catholic challenges and the Spanish Armada were at least relevant or directly appeared, especially in the case of the Spanish Armada question, which was worth 12 marks. The religious settlement appeared for the 4th time, which does include the sample paper, admittedly, showing that this is a very popular topic. But maybe that's not so surprising. It's a very big part of the course, and there's an awful lot of ways that you can write about it, so it applies itself to lots of different questions. Question 1A and 1C2 were on topics that have been covered before, for example, the things like the colonies and exploration, but not especially regularly. Question 1C2 on the failure of the Virginia colony seems to have been the slightly less popular one based on feedback that I've had so far, but that's only based upon teachers that I've spoken to and the pupils who have kindly commented on my YouTube videos. Largely, it seems that pupils have been pretty positive about the exam. Admittedly, there might be a certain amount of bias there because I did actually manage to predict quite a few of these things, and so people have been coming back and thanking me for that because they've revised them. So there might be a little bit of bias in the feedback that I'm getting there, but it does seem that people have been largely positive. So I think this was probably a pretty fair paper overall, with good opportunities to draw on broad knowledge and fairly well balanced 16-mark questions at the end. I wonder what you think. If you disagree with me, maybe you can comment and explain why. Let's move on to the more international studies, with the American West. This year's exam had the following questions. Explain 2 consequences of the extermination of the buffalo, worth 8 marks. Write a narrative account analysing the key events of the Donner Party expedition, also worth 8 marks. The stimulus points were the shortcut and snow blizzards. And then you could choose any 2 of the following 3 questions. The importance of the railroad network to the cattle industry, the importance of the Sand Creek Massacre to relations with Plains Indians, at least I think that's what it said. I thought this year the exam paper was going to go with Indigenous peoples, but maybe that's for next year. And the importance of sheriffs and marshals for law and order after 1876. Alright, let's have a look at this paper then. What do I think of it? The first question on consequences of the extermination of the buffalo I thought was really pretty generous. There's lots of consequences for that, and they're basically all negative for the indigenous peoples of the plains, or the Plains Indians as they used to be referred to by the exam board. So there's a lot that you could write about here in terms of greater reliance on the government, movement onto the reservations, and the changes to their way of life and assimilation with more European lifestyles. In terms of the second question, this is probably the most generous narrative account question that I've yet seen in this paper. Some of them have been truly horrific, and this one is probably only slightly more generous than the Mormons migration one, but I still think it's better than that. There's so many things you could write about with this, and it's a really memorable and famous story. And it's even, I think, got some pretty generous stimulus points as well. And in terms of explaining 2 of the following, well, this is where I think it gets quite a bit trickier. These questions look pretty simple on the face of things, but you'd have to read them pretty carefully to get them right. So in terms of explaining the importance of the railroad network, you would need to make sure that you are constantly explaining about its importance to the cattle industry rather than to migration more generally. So looking at how cattle were transported and then sold for greater prices in cities like Chicago, looking at the establishment of cow towns like Abilene, even looking at how it's contributed to the establishment of ranching on the open range. After all, John Iliff was moving his cattle towards the railhead towns. So there's lots you could write about there, but you just need to be careful to keep it on topic. The Sand Creek Massacre last came up in an absolutely horrifically bad narrative account question in 2018, and this one's a lot fairer than that, but you would need to make sure that you're looking really more at the consequences of the Sand Creek Massacre and people's reactions to it, as the other focus is relations with the Plains Indians. And in terms of the last one, the feedback I'm getting is that this one was the most tricky one. You either know it or you don't. The sort of mistake you could make with it would be to refer to law and order before 1876, for example, the problems and vigilantism that you had in the era of the gold rush. But actually, as long as you are focused on the post-1876 era, with examples like Wyatt Earp, then actually that'd be pretty good. Right, let's have a look at the things that I predicted, starting with the repeated inclusions. The only topic that I identified as repeatedly appearing on this particular exam paper was the development of the cattle industry. It had appeared 3 times in the sample paper 2019, 2022 and now in 2024, as it was relevant to question 3, or at least one of its options. So this time it was focused on the railroad network and how that impacted on the cattle industry. I suppose it was all about how the cattle were moved along the lines. Okay, I'm going to move on now. Again, I will just say that this is a good example of how, when you've got quite a broad topic, sometimes the exam board will just keep repeating it. And it's happened again. Moving on. Maybe showing a little bit of a lack of an imagination with the exam board, there were loads of things that had never appeared before on this particular exam paper. So in a sense, these predictions maybe aren't quite as accurate as they appear, because I did actually choose quite a few things. However, most people were absolutely delighted to see that the Donner Party had turned up for the narrative account question, but also that crime and lawlessness turned up for question 3 with one of the importance questions. So if you revise these things based on these predictions, you were probably really happy with that. That would have been quite a long list to revise, but I suppose it still narrows it down a fair bit, so it's probably quite helpful. What about the things that have rarely appeared? Well, there was something on this section as well. Abilene, specifically the cow town where cattle were herded to and then they were moved on to other cities to be sold at a higher price, that would have been absolutely relevant to the question 3 importance question, which looked at the railroads and the cattle industry. So that would have been good news. It was on the sample paper and has been relevant to cattle industry questions since, but it was really especially relevant to this one, as Abilene was a railhead cow town, which has got links to both the cattle industry and the railroad network. So absolutely ideal. And with the early conflicts with indigenous peoples, well, Little Crow's War didn't turn up this year, but the Sand Creek Massacre did. And that was in a Q3 importance question as well. So what's my final summary of the American West paper? So predictions about the Donner Party, crime and lawlessness, the cattle industry, related to railroads specifically, and the Sand Creek Massacre appeared or were at least relevant to this paper. Cattle industry questions appeared for the 4th time, including the sample paper, so this is clearly a very broad and popular topic. Question 1 on the extermination of the buffalo was probably quite a generous question. In question 2, the narrative account seems to have been very well received as well, and I agree. Pupils largely are positive about this exam, not just my pupils but also those commenting on YouTube as well, and it appears easier than last year's paper, to be honest, which may have some impact on grade boundaries, but you've got no control over that, so don't worry about it. I think this was a pretty fair to generous paper overall, with the question 3 topics perhaps the most challenging, and the more challenging probably than they appear at first reading. So hopefully you read those carefully and really gave it some thought before developing your answers. Okay, let's move on to the final topic that I'll be looking at. Superpower Relations, this year's exam. Question 1, explain 2 consequences of the Prague Spring. Question 2, write a narrative account analysing the collapse of Soviet control in Eastern Europe 1985 to 1991. That would include Gorbachev's new thinking and the end of the Warsaw Pact. Those were your stimulus points. Then you could choose any 2 of the following 3 questions. The importance of the Yalta Conference for international relations, the importance of the Berlin Ultimatum for tensions between East and West, and the importance of SALT 1 on relations between the USA and USSR. So what do I think of this particular exam? Well, to be honest with you, this is the topic that I know least about. I'm hoping to make a rapid revision series on this next year, so I'm really sorry if you did this and you didn't have that to help you this year. There's only so many hours in the day. I'm a full-time teacher. I won't go on about it anymore. But the point is, I will try and interpret this as best I can, even though I fully admit that I don't have the best subject knowledge at the moment. Maybe you can correct me on points in the comments, and maybe you can tell me what you thought of it. But for the most part, people seem to think that this was a pretty fair-ish exam paper. The reception was a little bit colder for this one than it was for the other topics, which is fair enough, and apparently that is quite a common thing with this. It's just quite a complicated topic. Two consequences of the Prague Spring seem to be pretty fair. People seemed all right with that one there. They could think of lots of different things like Brezhnev doctrine, for example. And the narrative account was all right, but the one thing that was kind of picked up here was the date range. 1985 to 1991 is pretty narrow. It wouldn't include, for example, things like the events in 1983 with Abel Archer and Gorbachev and Reagan having even further détente and letting relations simmer down even more. And also, I'm not quite sure what they mean by Eastern Europe here. I imagine that would absolutely have to include Berlin, with the fall of the Berlin Wall being maybe the most famous event in the overall loss of Soviet control in Eastern Europe, and the end of the Warsaw Pact falling apart as well. So there do seem to be quite a lot of things to write about here, but you would have to be careful to keep it within the date range. And I'm making the assumption here that Berlin would be included as Eastern Europe because it's, part of the Eastern Bloc. Maybe you can tell me better. In terms of the other questions, the international conferences, as we're about to have a look at, have come up quite a few times. Yalta is a pretty good one, though. I think most people were happy with that. The Berlin Ultimatum for tensions between East and West. Again, I think most people were okay-ish with that, but you'd need to have some pretty good knowledge and specific knowledge of Khrushchev and the way that he behaved towards the American administration. And also the importance of SALT 1 on relations between the USA and the USSR. So looking at this as part of the détente period and reducing Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, of course, is what SALT stands for. So reducing arms stocks and whether that really had an impact. Yeah, I mean, that's probably the one that I'm fuzziest on. Maybe you know more than I do on that. Of course, I'll know more next year, but I suppose I can't know everything, can I? As a result of not knowing this topic maybe so well as the others, though, well, maybe my predictions weren't so good. Again, I'm going to do my best here, but let's have a look at what I did predict and what appears to have come up. As you can see, there are quite a few things that have appeared repeatedly on the Superpower Relations exam. The one that came up again this year was Grand Alliance and Conferences. 2019 saw a question on the Potsdam Conference, 2021 was Tehran, and they were relevant to the 2023 narrative account as well. But they've appeared this time as part of question 3. At least they've changed which conference was the focus, which in this case was Yalta. Maybe with my predictions I should have made it clearer that perhaps Yalta would be the one to come up this year, but it's very difficult to be familiar with that when you don't teach the topic, I suppose. Anyway, hopefully that's something that you'd revised and you were comfortable with it. Let's consider what topics have never appeared. Having never taught this course, this is where I'm most shaky on how accurate my predictions were, so please do comment if I was accurate, or if I make any mistakes then please do tell me, as long as it's constructive. After all, we're all here to learn, and I'm especially keen to learn this as well. I think, though, that international reaction to the Soviets in Czechoslovakia, in terms especially of how the international community reacted to their invasion of 1968, would have been relevant to question 1 on the Prague Spring. Reagan and Gorbachev relations, though, I'm not quite so sure about. If it was a really early period, then it would fall outside of the 1985 to 1991 topic area that was in the narrative account question. New thinking might be relevant to this. But really, I think this question may have been more about the actual events that were going on in Eastern Europe during the fall. So I'm not quite so convinced that was a good prediction after all. What about the things that rarely appeared? Again, this is where I will invite you to clarify anything or correct anything that I get wrong, but this is my impression having never taught the course before. I suspect that Brezhnev doctrine, which last appeared in 2018 for an importance question, would have this time been at least relevant to question 1, the consequences question looking at the Prague Spring. Brezhnev doctrine happens after the Prague Spring. I think it comes out of it as a reaction to making sure that those satellite states in Eastern Europe don't move away from the Soviet Union. So I think that probably would have been relevant. In terms of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think that was probably relevant to the question 2 narrative, collapse of the Soviet control question as well. I wasn't entirely convinced by this phrase Eastern Europe, but I think most of us have got to agree that the fall of the Berlin Wall is absolutely critical to that period and the loss of Soviet control. So I very much suspect this would have been absolutely relevant to that question too. So what are my overall impressions? Honesty as an academic is really important, and I've tried to be like that in this final part of this reflections video. Ultimately, my lack of experience with this course makes me less confident, but predictions about Czechoslovakia, Brezhnev Doctrine and Gorbachev seem to have been at least relevant to some questions, as was the one on the Berlin Wall. The Grand Alliance conferences have actually appeared for 4 times now, but this was the first time that Yalta had appeared, so that is kind of new as well. Reactions to the paper seem to have been, well, pretty mixed, to be honest with you. Pupils and teachers seemed okay with question 1 on the Prague Spring. However, the date range of question 2, the narrative account, has caused some concern. The Berlin Ultimatum and SALT 1 importance question in question 3 seem to have been poorly received as being really quite narrow and difficult to develop a detailed answer about. However, here's a bit of encouragement. If the paper was difficult overall, this will be reflected in fair grade boundaries, so don't feel that you're going to be prejudiced in terms of your mark compared to the other papers that could have been chosen. So overall, yeah, it's probably a fairly balanced paper, and I have had a couple of teachers say that they felt it was pretty generous. It might just be my lack of experience that makes me kind of err on the side of caution with this one. That's the last paper we're going to look at. Let's close out with some final points. That's hopefully the last time you'll ever have to think about paper 2, which seems like good news, I suppose. That just leaves me to say good luck for paper 3. You'll definitely have earned a rest after that one. However, I'll be releasing another one of these reflections videos within a day or so of that exam being sat, so keep an eye out for that if you are curious. Also, I'd encourage you to check out my paper 3 predictions video. I've been really pleased with how the predictions have gone this year and actually pretty surprised. Whether it's just dumb luck or whether my system of trying to map out what's appeared before, what hasn't appeared before and try and look for patterns is working, I don't know, but I'm really pleased that I've done it, and I'm glad that so many people asked for it and encouraged me to do it. My paper 3 predictions video will cover the topics Germany 1918 to 1939, USA conflict at home and abroad, that's the civil rights and Vietnam topic, and Russia and the Soviet Union. If you're one of the few pupils who does Mao's China, I'm really sorry, but I'm not going to be doing predictions on that. Quite simply, I don't trust myself to be able to make even slightly educated guesses and predictions on that particular paper. I don't know it well enough, I don't know the history well enough, and quite simply there isn't enough data for me to go on other than just the exam papers themselves. So rather than make bad and useless predictions, which are based on nothing, I'd rather not just do it at all. So sorry about that if that is you, but those are my reasons. My other bit of advice, as I've already said, is just don't dwell on paper 1 and 2 anymore, no matter how you feel it went, whether it went great or whether you're a bit nervous over it. On to the next task at hand, you can't actually change anything now. One last little appeal for help though. Please do subscribe, and especially stay subscribed after the exams, if you'd like to thank me for my efforts on this channel. I'm a full-time teacher with a regular job, and I just do this in my afternoons, and I've got to be honest with you, it is a tremendous amount of work for me, but I do think it's worth it for the very many people that I've managed to help. And after all, I originally just started this for my own pupils, and now I feel like I've got an even bigger classroom. So if you do want to thank me, do click that subscribe button, and like I say, stay subscribed afterwards. The YouTube algorithm simply doesn't understand when people start dropping away and my views go down after exam periods. I know about it, but their computer brain doesn't. So if you do want to thank me, that's the best way of doing it. Enough waffling for now. I hope that's been interesting for you. Check out those paper 3 predictions, and I'll say goodbye for now, and thanks for watching.